Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, and in this presentation I aim to explain the outcome of World War I by looking at the extent of the mobilisation of human resources, as millions of men were desperately needed on the different fronts. World War I was a total war, and that meant the mobilisation of human resources. Let's look first at the men in uniform available to the Entente powers and their allies and those of the Central Powers in 1914. Only Britain had a volunteer army. The other nations had much larger conscript armies that required 2 to 3 years of service from able-bodied males of military age, to be followed by several years in the reserves, which accounts for the huge numbers in uniform as war broke out. The training, leadership and armament of the German army reduced the importance of the initial numerical inferiority of the armies of the Central Powers. They also had the rail links and meticulous plans to move their troops quickly. Coupled with the comparative slowness of mobilization, poor leadership and lower scale of armament of the Russian armies, it meant that there was an approximate balance of forces between the Central Powers and the Allies in August 1914 that prevented either side from gaining a quick victory. But we should also take account of the populations of the rival blocs, as there was always the potential for more conscription and more fighting men, and for a bigger workforce to produce the weapons of war, though here we have to also take account of their economies, particularly the extent to which they had industrialised. Britain and Ireland had a population of 46 million, France 40 million, Russia somewhere around 170 million. Whereas Germany had a population of around 68 million and Austria-Hungary about 52 million. Now, I'll look at the workforce in another presentation. But even Britain, which had traditionally had a small standing army, quickly realised that a lot more men were required if defeat was to be avoided, never mind victory secured. And we could add if the horrific losses were to be sustained. And so first appealed for volunteers, and only midway through the war finally turned to conscription. Lord Kitchener called for volunteers in August 1914, and some 750,000 men immediately volunteered, rising to 2.5 million men by the time conscription was introduced in 1916. This was Kitchener's army, and though it wasn't their first battle, they were well and truly bloodied at the Somme. And in 1916, Britain finally introduced conscription for unmarried men aged 18 to 41. This was subsequently extended to include married men and men up to the age of 50. The number of men conscripted is estimated to be a little over 1.5 million, a little under half of the British Army in the war. In Germany, compulsory military service had been the norm since long before the war. In 1914, men, on reaching the age of 20, could expect to serve 2, or for the cavalry or artillery, 3 years of active service, though in reality only half of each age group would be conscripted. And then they'd serve 4 or 5 years in the reserves, which meant annual training exercises. After this, they would return to civilian life, but could be called up in the event of war up to the age of 45. With younger, more recently trained men being called up first. This This is why in 1914 the German army grew from 800,000 to 3.5 million men in just 12 days. In Austria-Hungary, men served for 3 years, with a further 7 years in the reserves. The French system was similar to the German one, with men undertaking compulsory service aged 20 to 23, followed by a period as reservists until the age of 34, so that the French were able to mobilise almost 3 million men by the end of August 1914. The Russian system was actually modelled on the German one. In 1914, military service was mandatory for all Russian males over the age of 20 and lasted for 3 or 4 years, with a further 7 years in the reserves. So that in 1914, and don't forget Russia had by far the biggest population of the European countries, there were around 1.4 million men in its peacetime standing army, and about 6.5 million men in uniform by the end of August 1914. Amazing numbers. But it's when we look at the total numbers who fought that we really get a sense of the scale of the war and the significance of human resources in deciding the outcome of the war. Britain put 5 million men into uniform, and there were about 3 million from the Dominions. India, which provided 1.4 million men, including labourers and the rest of the empire, plus 100,000 more labourers, with similar numbers of labourers coming from China and Africa, and somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 from Egypt. These forgotten men would do anything from digging and repairing trenches, unloading ships, repairing roads and railways, and transporting supplies, ammunition and water to the front. France put about 8 million men into uniform, between 21 and 22% of its population, plus another 900,000 from its colonies. And France also recruited about 50,000 labourers from Indochina and roughly 130,000 from North Africa. Italy mobilised 5.6 million men, and America had slightly more than 2 million men in France, with more able to follow if the war hadn't ended. Germany had a total of around 13 million men in uniform, 18% of its population. Austria-Hungary had a total of 7.8 million serving by the war's end. And the Ottoman Empire had 3 million men. And finally, Russia had 15 million men in uniform, somewhere around 65 million men from more than 30 countries in total. Absolutely staggering numbers. So, human resources were a huge factor on the battlefield, and I really should add that somewhere between 9 to 11 million men died, with twice that number seriously injured. And by the nature of things, they were mostly young men. The average age of casualties was in the 25 to 27 age bracket, but more 19-year-olds were killed than any other age. That is truly a staggering thought to leave you with. History is always, at its heart, about people. Of course, the human resource was important when we turned to the economic resources of countries too. But as I said, I'll leave that for another presentation. Don't forget, there's my website, History Made Easier too. That's there to help you, hopefully. Do check it out if you haven't done so already. But for now, let me thank you so much for listening and wish you the very best of luck in your studies. Cheers.